probably the point that's worth making about that terminology of lone wolves is that it's really sort of a misnomer. It misrepresents the role of ideology and of an organization and its propaganda campaign in providing the material that inspires someone to commit an attack like what's happened in New Orleans. And calling it a lone wolf or a lone actor tends to suggest that this happens in complete isolation rather than it being part of usually a campaign by a terrorist organization to inspire people to act individually and by themselves.
And so I guess the whole way that it's being described is a bit problematic then, because it makes it sound as though ISIS hasn't had any role in this, but you're saying that's actually not the case.
Yeah, I mean, this one's particularly interesting in that it's some time since Islamic State was prioritizing that sort of narrative in their propaganda of lone actor operations or individual operations in the West. That content hasn't gone away, which is part of the challenge of contemporary terrorism and extremism, is that all of that material that provided inspiration for the litany of individual acts of terrorism that took place between sort of 2014 and 2018 still exists. It's harder to access than it was then when it was fairly easy to access via platforms like Twitter. But the challenge with anything to do with terrorist or extremist ideology is that the motivating material and the doctrinal and instructional material remains available in digital form if you look hard enough.
I'm really intrigued by that, Levi. So is the very term lone wolf itself, is that something that's been put out there and propagated by ISIS as part of their messaging to scare people?
Without going down a rabbit hole of the history of the terminology, lone wolves is a term that originates from the extreme right in the United States, as does sort of the strategy or the idea, the organizational structure idea that sits behind the idea of what the extreme right called leaderless resistance. The jihadist movement adopted it in part in the mid 2000s. They called it individual and small cell jihad. They're the same idea under different packaging and different labeling. As a strategy, it's a way of maintaining operational capability without raising the intelligence red flags that you would from having a cell of 6 people communicating with each other, let alone communicating back to a command structure. All of those communications raise risks for a terrorist organization of being found out. So having people act individually dramatically decreases the potential for interception or intelligence collection or whatever the case may be. It has a long history. The term lone wolf is largely only used anymore by the media. You won't hear very many government officials from the Five Eyes community, at least, or Western governments using the term lone wolf. They might use lone actor. That being said, it has very much been incorporated into the jihadist narrative in their propaganda. So they are strong and explicit advocates of what they call lone jihad. So the challenge with it is trying to sort of use relatively neutral language that doesn't glorify the actions, and lone wolf is largely assessed to have been something that makes it sort of, that glorifies the activity.
And we know that there was a flag, an ISIS flag, in the vehicle that was used in New Orleans. What do you see as the link to ISIS? Because we haven't heard any claims from ISIS yet, have we?
No, and that's probably the really interesting thing with this particular attack is that normally what you would see is some sort of demonstration or communication of a pledge of allegiance, or what's called a bayat, to Islamic State, and then in response, Islamic State would release an Amok news agency, what essentially amounts to a press release, claiming the perpetrator as a soldier of the caliphate or a knight of the caliphate, and endorsing that it was in fact an Islamic State operation, even though the relationship between the perpetrator and the organization is largely one way. Right, the organization is producing propaganda. The perpetrator is, for the most part, just consuming that propaganda. They don't actually have what we would consider to be a formal relationship with Islamic State, which can make it challenging from both a conceptual perspective, but also from a prosecution perspective. There's some really interesting case law out of South Australia around what being a member of a terrorist organization actually constitutes in legal terms, which is a reasonably expansive interpretation of that, which is positive. But it is a very challenging thing to sort of get people to recognize that someone who's never been to the region, never dealt with anyone from the organization, but through their actions and their beliefs winds up sort of being a member, if you sort of get the complexity of that. So,
And ISIS has been relatively recently putting out statements and putting out messages about attacks, hasn't it?
Yeah, so I think probably the big picture thing to keep in mind with understanding what happened in New Orleans is that Islamic State didn't go away. And there's some good pieces in the Australian press over the last 24 hours sort of touching on some of this. Whilst they were largely and fairly comprehensively degraded in Syria and Iraq, which is where US and Australian and other allied forces were directly confronting them, they largely relocated their center of gravity to North Africa, and they remain and have been since the so-called destruction of the caliphate, incredibly active across North Africa. For instance, on the same day that the attack happened in New Orleans, Islamic State's footprint in Somalia launched an attack against Somali military facilities that killed 22 people. Yeah, they are operating with a high degree of tempo in North Africa. They've been producing propaganda reasonably consistently, but not like they were in 2014 and beyond, when they had a proper media center that was producing that whole sort of full court press of full spectrum propaganda. So they have been producing propaganda. They have been making calls. They've been trying to exploit what's happening in Gaza and beyond. But not the same sort of volume and frequency of English language content directly trying to inspire people to undertake attacks.
And look, just finally, given the nature of these kind of attacks, that they are typically individuals where there's not, as you mentioned, that back and forth of communications between them and ISIS, how can they be anticipated? And is there more work that police and security authorities need to be doing on this?
Yeah, so I think probably the thing that's worth pointing out in regards to New Orleans is that those things had been done, and if it wasn't for the fact that the bollards that would have stopped this perpetrator from undertaking his attack hadn't been being repaired in preparation for a big football game that's happening in New Orleans next month, I think, then he wouldn't have been able to drive down Bourbon Street, right? That in response to the litany of vehicle ramming attacks that happened between 2014 and sort of 18, we rolled out a whole litany of different strategies and approaches that included things like hardening targets that we assessed to be high value to a potential terrorist and so on and so forth. And Bourbon Street is a good example of that, of it working perfectly, except for the fact that they were being repaired. Otherwise, they would have done exactly what they were supposed to do. Anyone who spent any time in a major CBD has seen all of the various pieces of of target hardening that have been rolled out over the past sort of decade or so. In terms of anticipating it, it's exceedingly challenging and involves sometimes a bit of luck going the right way. For instance, it's been reported overnight that authorities were made aware of some of the more hardcore or inflammatory content that he'd posted, but this was hours before the incident took place. And the capacity for a large-scale federal government apparatus to turn that coming into the system into finding an individual, locating that individual, and then intercepting their operation is an extremely challenging undertaking. It's the reason why organizations like Islamic State utilize the strategy, is because it's very, very difficult to anticipate.